Chapter 7. The High Price of Ownership. Why we overvalue what we have. At Duke University, basketball is somewhere between a passionate hobby and a religious experience. The basketball stadium is small and old and has bad acoustics, the kind that turn the cheers of the crowd into thunder and pump everyone's adrenaline level right through the roof. The small size of the stadium creates intimacy but also means there are not enough seats to contain all the fans who want to attend the games. This, by the way, is how Duke likes it, and the university has expressed little interest in exchanging the small, intimate stadium for a larger one. To ration the tickets, an intricate selection process has been developed over the years, to separate the truly devoted fans from all the rest. Even before the start of the spring semester, students who want to attend the games pitch tents in the open grassy area outside the stadium. Each tent holds up to 10 students. The campers who arrive first take the spots closest to the stadium's entrance, and the ones who come later line up farther back. The evolving community is called Krzyzewskiewicz, reflecting the respect the students have for Coach K. Mike Krzyzewski as well as their aspirations for victory in the coming season. So that the serious basketball fans are separated from those without Duke blue running through their veins, an air horn is sounded at random times. At the sound, a countdown begins, and within the next 5 minutes at least one person from each tent must check in with the basketball authorities. If a tent fails to register within these 5 minutes, the whole tent gets bumped to the end of the line. This procedure continues for most of the spring semester, and intensifies in the last 48 hours before a game. At that point, 48 hours before a game, the checks become personal checks. From then on, the tents are merely a social structure. When the air horn is sounded, every student has to check in personally with the basketball authorities. Missing an occupancy check in these final 2 days can mean being bumped to the end of the line. Although the air horn sounds occasionally before routine games, it can be heard at all hours of night and day before the really big contests, such as games against the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill and during the national championships. But that's not the oddest part of the ritual. The oddest part is that for the really important games, such as the national titles, the students at the front of the line still don't get a ticket. Rather, each of them gets a lottery number. Only later, as they crowd around a list of winners posted at the student center, do they find out if they have really, truly won a ticket to the coveted game. As Ziv Carmen, a professor at INSEAD, and I listened to the air horn during the campout at Duke in the spring of 1994, we were intrigued by the real-life experiment going on before our eyes. All the students who were camping out wanted passionately to go to the basketball game. They had all camped out for a long time for the privilege. But when the lottery was over, some of them would become ticket owners, while others would not. The question was this: would the students who had won tickets who had ownership of tickets value those tickets more than the students who had not won them even though they all worked equally hard to obtain them? On the basis of Jacknitsk, Dick Thaler, and Daniel Kahneman's research on the endowment effect, we predicted that when we own something, whether it's a car or a violin, a cat, or a basketball ticket, we begin to value it more than other people do. Think about this for a minute. Why does the seller of a house usually value that property more than the potential buyer? Why does the seller of an automobile envision a higher price than the buyer? In many transactions, why does the owner believe that his possession is worth more money than the potential owner is willing to pay? There's an old saying, one man's ceiling is another man's floor. Well, when you're the owner, you're at the ceiling, and when you're the buyer, you're at the floor. To be sure, that is not always the case. I have a friend who contributed a full box of record albums to a garage sale, for instance, simply because he couldn't stand hauling them around any longer. The first person who came along offered him $25 for the whole box, without even looking at the titles, and my friend accepted it. The buyer probably sold them for 10 times that price the following day. Indeed, if we always overvalued what we had, there would be no such thing as Antiques Roadshow. How much did you pay for this powder horn? $5. Well, let me tell you, you have a national treasure here. But this caveat aside, we still believed that in general the ownership of something increases its value in the owner's eyes. Were we right? Did the students at Duke who had won the tickets who could now anticipate experiencing the packed stands and the players racing across the court value them more than the students who had not won them? There was only one good way to find out: get them to tell us how much they valued the tickets. In this case, Ziv and I would try to buy tickets from some of the students who had won them and sell them to those who didn't. That's right, we were about to become ticket scalpers. That night we got a list of the students who had won the lottery and those who hadn't, and we started telephoning. Our first call was to William, a senior majoring in chemistry. William was rather busy. After camping for the previous week, he had a lot of homework and email to catch up on. He was not too happy, either, because after reaching the front of the line, he was still not one of the lucky ones who had won a ticket in the lottery. "Hi, William," I said. "I understand you didn't get one of the tickets for the Final Four." "That's right. We may be able to sell you a ticket." "Cool. How much would you be willing to pay for one?" "How about $100, he replied. "Too low," I laughed. "You'll have to go higher." $150, he offered. "You have to do better," I insisted. "What's the highest price you'll pay?" William thought for a moment. $175. "That's it?" "That's it. Not a penny more." "Okay, you're on the list." "I'll let you know," I said. "By the way, how'd you come up with that $175? William said he figured that for $175 he could also watch the game at a sports bar, free, spend some money on beer and food, and still have a lot left over for a few CDs or even some shoes. The game would no doubt be exciting," he said, "but at the same time $175 is a lot of money." Our next call was to Joseph. After camping out for a week, Joseph was also behind on his schoolwork. But he didn't care. He had won a ticket in the lottery and now, in a few days, he would be watching the Duke players fight for the national title. "Hi, Joseph," I said. "We may have an opportunity for you to sell your ticket. What's your minimum price?" "I don't have one." "Everyone has a price," I replied, giving the comment my best Al Pacino tone. His first answer was $3,000. "Come on," I said, "that's way too much. Be reasonable, you have to offer a lower price." "All right," he said, $2,400. "Are you sure?" I asked. "That's as low as I'll go." "Okay. If I can find a buyer at that price, I'll give you a call. By the way," I added, "how did you come up with that price?" "Duke basketball is a huge part of my life here," he said passionately. He then went on to explain that the game would be a defining memory of his time at Duke, an experience that he would pass on to his children and grandchildren. "So how can you put a price on that?" he asked. "Can you put a price on memories?" William and Joseph were just two of more than 100 students whom we called. In general, the students who did not own a ticket were willing to pay around $170 for one. The price they were willing to pay, as in William's case, was tempered by alternative uses for the money, such as spending it in a sports bar for drinks and food. Those who owned a ticket, on the other hand, demanded about $2,400 for it. Like Joseph, they justified their price in terms of the importance of the experience and the lifelong memories it would create. What was really surprising, though, was that in all our phone calls, not a single person was willing to sell a ticket at a price that someone else was willing to pay. What did we have? We had a group of students all hungry for a basketball ticket before the lottery drawing, and then, bang, in an instant after the drawing, they were divided into two groups: ticket owners and non-ticket owners. It was an emotional chasm that was formed, between those who now imagined the glory of the game, and those who imagined what else they could buy with the price of the ticket. and it was an empirical chasm as well. The average selling price, about $2,400, was separated by a factor of about 14 from the average buyer's offer, about $175. From a rational perspective, both the ticket holders and the non-ticket holders should have thought of the game in exactly the same way. After all, the anticipated atmosphere at the game and the enjoyment one could expect from the experience should not depend on winning a lottery. Then how could a random lottery drawing have changed the student's view of the game and the value of the tickets so dramatically? Ownership pervades our lives and, in a strange way, shapes many of the things we do. Adam Smith wrote, "Every man and woman lives by exchanging, or becomes in some measure a merchant, and the society itself grows to be what is properly a commercial society." That's an awesome thought. Much of our life story can be told by describing the ebb and flow of our particular possessions, what we get and what we give up. We buy clothes and food, automobiles and homes, for instance. And we sell things as well, homes and cars, and in the course of our careers, our time. Since so much of our lives is dedicated to ownership, wouldn't it be nice to make the best decisions about this? Wouldn't it be nice, for instance, to know exactly how much we would enjoy a new home, a new car, a different sofa, and an Armani suit, so that we could make accurate decisions about owning them? Unfortunately, this is rarely the case. We are mostly fumbling around in the dark. Why? Because of three irrational quirks in our human nature. The first quirk, as we saw in the case of the basketball tickets, is that we fall in love with what we already have. Suppose you decide to sell your old VW bus. What do you start doing? Even before you put a for sale sign in the window, you begin to recall trips you took. You were much younger, of course, the kids hadn't sprouted into teenagers. A warm glow of remembrance washes over you and the car. This applies not only to VW buses, of course, but to everything else. And it can happen fast. For instance, two of my friends adopted a child from China and told me this remarkable story. They went to China with 12 other couples. When they reached the orphanage, the director took each of the couples separately into a room and presented them with a daughter. When the couples reconvened the following morning, they all commented on the director's wisdom. Somehow she knew exactly which little girl to give to each couple. The matches were perfect. My friends felt the same way, but they also realized that the matches had been random. What made each match seem perfect was not the Chinese woman's talent, but nature's ability to make us instantly attached to what we have. The second quirk is that we focus on what we may lose, rather than what we may gain. When we price our beloved VW, therefore, we think more about what we will lose, the use of the bus, than what we will gain, money to buy something else. Likewise, the ticket holder focuses on losing the basketball experience, rather than imagining the enjoyment of obtaining money or on what can be purchased with it. Our aversion to loss is a strong emotion, and as I will explain later in the book, one that sometimes causes us to make bad decisions. Do you wonder why we often refuse to sell some of our cherished clutter, and if somebody offers to buy it, we attach an exorbitant price tag to it? As soon as we begin thinking about giving up our valued possessions, we are already mourning the loss. The third quirk is that we assume other people will see the transaction from the same perspective as we do. We somehow expect the buyer of our VW to share our feelings, emotions, and memories. Or we expect the buyer of our house to appreciate how the sunlight filters through the kitchen windows. Unfortunately, the buyer of the VW is more likely to notice the puff of smoke that is emitted as you shift from first into second, and the buyer of your house is more likely to notice the strip of black mold in the corner. It is just difficult for us to imagine that the person on the other side of the transaction, buyer or seller, is not seeing the world as we see it. Ownership also has what I'd call peculiarities. For one, the more work you put into something, the more ownership you begin to feel for it. Think about the last time you assembled some furniture. Figuring out which piece goes where and which screw fits into which hole boosts the feeling of ownership. In fact, I can say with a fair amount of certainty that pride of ownership is inversely proportional to the ease with which one assembles the furniture, wires the high-density television to the surround sound system, installs software, or gets the baby into the bath, dried, powdered, diapered, and tucked away in the crib. My friend and colleague Mike Norton, a professor at Harvard, and I have a term for this phenomenon, the IKEA effect. Another peculiarity is that we can begin to feel ownership even before we own something. Think about the last time you entered an online auction. Suppose you make your first bid on Monday morning, for a wristwatch, and at this point you are the highest bidder. That night you log on, and you're still the top dog. Ditto for the next night. You start thinking about that elegant watch. You imagine it on your wrist, you imagine the compliments you'll get. And then you go online again 1 hour before the end of the auction. Some dog has topped your bid. Someone else will take your watch. So you increase your bid beyond what you had originally planned. Is the feeling of partial ownership causing the upward spiral we often see in online auctions? Is it the case that the longer an auction continues, the greater grip virtual ownership will have on the various bidders and the more money they will spend? A few years ago, James Heyman, Yesem Orhun, a professor at the University of Chicago, and I set up an experiment to explore how the duration of an auction gradually affects the auction's participants and encourages them to bid to the bitter end. As we suspected, the participants who were the highest bidders, for the longest periods of time, ended up with the strongest feelings of virtual ownership. Of course, they were in a vulnerable position. Once they thought of themselves as owners, they were compelled to prevent losing their position by bidding higher and higher. Virtual ownership, of course, is one mainspring of the advertising industry. We see a happy couple driving down the California coastline in a BMW convertible, and we imagine ourselves there. We get a catalog of hiking clothing from Patagonia, see a polyester fleece pullover, and poof, we start thinking of it as ours. The trap is set, and we willingly walk in. We become partial owners even before we own anything. There's another way that we can get drawn into ownership. Often, companies will have trial promotions. If we have a basic cable television package, for instance, we are lured into a digital gold package by a special trial rate, only $59 a month instead of the usual $89. After all, we tell ourselves, we can always go back to basic cable or downgrade to the silver package. But once we try the gold package, of course, we claim ownership of it. Will we really have the strength to downgrade back to basic or even to digital silver? Doubtful. At the onset, we may think that we can easily return to the basic service, but once we are comfortable with the digital picture, we begin to incorporate our ownership of it into our view of the world and ourselves, and quickly rationalize away the additional price. More than that, our aversion to the loss of that nice crisp gold package picture and the extra channels is too much for us to bear. In other words, before we make the switch we may not be certain that the cost of the digital gold package is worth the full price, but once we have it, the emotions of ownership come welling up, to tell us that the loss of digital gold is more painful than spending a few more dollars a month. We may think we can turn back, but that is actually much harder than we expected. Another example of the same hook is the 30-day money-back guarantee. If we are not sure whether or not we should get a new sofa, the guarantee of being able to change our mind later may push us over the hump so that we end up getting it. We fail to appreciate how our perspective will shift once we have it at home, and how we will start viewing the sofa as ours and consequently start viewing returning it as a loss. We might think we are taking it home only to try it out for a few days, but in fact we are becoming owners of it. And are unaware of the emotions the sofa can ignite in us. Ownership is not limited to material things. It can also apply to points of view. Once we take ownership of an idea, whether it's about politics or sports, what do? We love it perhaps more than we should. We prize it more than it is worth. And most frequently, we have trouble letting go of it because we can't stand the idea of its loss. What are we left with then? An ideology rigid and unyielding. There is no known cure for the ills of ownership. As Adam Smith said, it is woven into our lives. But being aware of it might help. Everywhere around us we see the temptation to improve the quality of our lives by buying a larger home, a second car, a new dishwasher, a lawnmower, and so on. But, once we change our possessions we have a very hard time going back down. As I noted earlier, ownership simply changes our perspective. Suddenly, moving backward to our pre-ownership state is a loss, one that we cannot abide. And so, while moving up in life, we indulge ourselves with the fantasy that we can always ratchet ourselves back if need be, but in reality, we can't. Downgrading to a smaller home, for instance, is experienced as a loss, it is psychologically painful, and we are willing to make all kinds of sacrifices in order to avoid such losses even if, in this case, the monthly mortgage sinks our ship. My own approach is to try to view all transactions, particularly large ones, as if I were a non-owner, putting some distance between myself and the item of interest. In this attempt, I'm not certain if I have achieved the uninterest in material things that is espoused by the Hindu sannyasi, but at least I try to be as zen as I can about it.